Elizabeth Hinton, a historian, associate professor of history and African American studies at Yale University, professor of law at the Yale Law School. Her research focuses on the persistence of poverty and racial inequality in the 20th century. And she has a new book out, an extraordinary book. It's called America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s. Professor Hinton, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us today. There's a kind of a cycle, it seems, like a dog chasing its tail, of increased policing producing increased resistance and rebellion, producing increased policing, going back and forth. Can you explain how this works?
Yeah, it's a wash, rinse, repeat. Thanks so much, Thom, for having me on the show. Yeah, so there's a policy cycle where, the response historically to various forms of violent political protest that is seen as criminal, that is not seen as being linked to a larger set of demands for socioeconomic inclusion and expanded access to jobs and education and decent housing, gets labeled as criminal, and therefore the only solution becomes the police. And the police in themselves, when we look at the history of this violent protest, end up inciting the violence. And so we've been stuck in this cycle of police violence and community responses to that violence, and also this cycle of policies that consistently invest in policing and surveillance and incarceration at the expense of or while disinvesting from social welfare programs.
So, I remember the 60s. I was a teenager in the 60s. It was a time of great hope and yet great struggle. And you talk about how, well, actually, what do you see as the starting point for this kind of modern version of history? I mean, does this go back to is there a particular political trigger or a moment in time, whether it's Goldwater or Nixon's Southern strategy or something like, or the Brown v. Board, or where do we start with this story in the modern era?
Yeah. I mean, of course, we can go back hundreds of years, but I think the 60s is really important in terms of understanding where we are today. And in many ways, we're still living in the kind of aftershocks of both the violence in the 1960s. I mean, the so-called riots, the rebellions between 1964 to 1972, coupled with, the anti-war protest movement. But this was the largest, this is the moment of greatest domestic bloodshed since the Civil War. And we begin to see really important transitions in domestic policies. It is in 1965 when Lyndon Johnson, this is a year after he calls for the war on poverty, calls for the war on crime, begins an unprecedented federal investment in local police forces and court systems and prisons. For the first time in American history, the federal government started granting local police departments with taxpayer dollars, expanding police and militarizing urban police forces. And this set us on a policy path that eventually culminated in the U.S. being home to the largest prison system on the planet and a mass incarceration society. So I really think that the demographic changes in the 1960s, the civil rights revolution, and also the origins, the rise of the modernization of policing and the criminal justice system as we know it taking place during this period really makes that decade a pivotal one to understand where we are today and how we got here.
Yeah. Having lived through that era, my recollection of the way that, in fact, one of the, where I was when I was 2, 3, 4 years old in the early 1950s in Detroit, where my parents lived, and me, that entire community burned down in the riots, in the Detroit so-called riots. And those riots, in scare quotes, were portrayed in the media at the time as basically black people misbehaving. My understanding is that every single one of these rebellions, essentially, as you're calling them in your book. We're talking with Professor Elizabeth Hinton, her new book, America on Fire. Every single one of these, from L.A. to New York and every place in between, was triggered or ignited by police violence. Am I recalling that correctly?
Yes, yes. The rebellions in the 60s and 70s, for the most part, like Detroit in 1967, which occurred after the police raided a black speakeasy, occurred in response to the policing of ordinary everyday activity. Again, things that happen more frequently as police forces themselves expanded as a result of the war on crime. And from, Miami in 1980, Los Angeles 1992, and today, it's not, these forms of protest don't emerge in response to the policing of the ordinary and everyday, but exceptional incidents of police violence or police killings and miscarriages of justice. But they are all rooted in an encounter between police officers and black residents who they are charged with protecting. We have multiple forces that are kind of all pouring into the same river, as it were. You've got the Brown v. Board decision in 1954. You've got the massive resistance campaign that was launched by white people in numerous states to stop the integration of schools throughout the late 50s and into the 60s. You've got the rapid growth and widespread popularization is probably the wrong word, but it became part of the public dialogue of the civil rights movement and the rise of Dr. Martin Luther King and others, the Black Panthers during that era as well. And then you've got this white backlash that apparently began with Lyndon Johnson. You're saying certainly Richard Nixon, the Southern strategy. How do these? It's like a dance. How do these things interact with each other, and what are the major parts that are still echoing into our lives and our society right now? Yeah, so it's the Johnson is a really complicated figure in all of this, of course, because the programs of the war on crime are unfolding alongside the programs of the war on poverty as part of the Great Society and part of the sincere attempt on the part of Johnson and of other liberal policymakers to improve American society and to address the enduring problem of racial discrimination and inequality in America. But unfortunately, the kind of punitive policies that Johnson introduced into domestic policies follow this kind of larger historical pattern that, every time the bounds of citizenship expand and rights are extended, particularly to African Americans, we see new forms of criminal laws and the expansion of the prison system. We saw this, of course, after the Civil War, when the Southern states almost immediately enacted a set of laws known as the Black Codes that criminalized newly freed people and essentially placed them in a new penal labor regime called the convict lease system. This was the first mass incarceration, and then flash forward 100 years, 1965, Johnson calls for the war on crime 1 week before he sends the Voting Rights Act to Congress. And it was kind of a carrot and a stick, I think, of domestic policy where, the programs of the war on poverty, which did not represent a structural transformation, as the Kerner Commission, noted in its famous report of 1968, did not go far enough in terms of addressing the root causes of poverty and inequality. But that was Johnson's attempt. And the police and his increasing embrace of policing and surveillance programs in targeted low-income communities of color throughout the 1960s, again, as rebellion increased in intensity and frequency through every summer of his presidency, were about kind of managing the material consequences of poverty and racial discrimination as they emerged through the persistence of rebellion and crime and violence in low-income communities. So increasingly, Johnson and other liberals, as the rebellions continued and persisted, came to embrace the programs and strategies of the war on crime as a kind of long-term solution over even the programs of the war on poverty. So when Johnson, one of the last pieces of legislation that Johnson signs on his way out of office the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 created the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration in the Department of Justice, which was kind of the more permanent formation of the Office of Law Enforcement Assistance that steered the early programs of the war on crime. But the Office of Economic Opportunity, that was kind of the steering office of the war on poverty, where community action grants were allocated, never received that kind of permanent implementation. And by the end of the 60s, you get police officers assuming many of the previous functions of the social welfare programs of the war on poverty. So ultimately, it is this kind of turn towards policing as the foremost urban policy, particularly in low-income communities of color, that is a legacy of the Johnson administration, and that ultimately won out, and that Richard Nixon, as you mentioned, seized upon when he took office in early '69.
Right. Yeah. Professor Hinton, can you stick around for the next 10 minutes with us? We'll be passing through 2 breaks, so we're hitting one right now, but stick around. We'll be just on the other side of this. Professor Elizabeth Hinton is with us. She has a new book, America on Fire, the subtitle, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s. An extraordinary new book. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Professor Hinton, what in the context of teaching, I mean, you're teaching these subjects at Yale University. Earlier in the program, I was reading from a Louisiana 8th grade textbook that tells the story of this poor white woman, not poor, she owned a 1,000-acre plantation with 120 enslaved humans, and the struggles she went through as a result of emancipation, and suddenly she had to start paying wages to people. Oh my God. How do we teach this? How do we fix American history?
Yeah, so, and this is, of course, the question right now as critical race theory comes under attack. And I think, when that term critical race theory is getting thrown around, people are essentially talking about teaching the history of racial oppression and exploitation and the way that racism, that American institutions, have functioned through a racist system and through racial hierarchy throughout our history. So I think, part of it is centering the role of racist exploitation and systemic racism in shaping the development of political and economic institutions in the U.S. And I think, one of the things that I don't think, and many fellow historians would agree, that we have really dealt with enough in this country in our school curriculums, but also in our monuments in general, is really understanding the history of slavery, the history of dispossession and conquest of indigenous peoples in this country, and other histories of marginalization of racialized groups. We haven't fully come to terms with this and fail to recognize, the ways in which even things like the voting suppression laws that we're seeing crop up across the United States today are rooted in this much older tradition of segregation and the systematic denial of people of color and Black people in particular of the franchise. And so, history to me is so important in terms of understanding how we got here, understanding the present, and then being able to find a path to a more equitable and just future. And so if we're not telling the truth about our history, then we're never going to be able to get there. We're never going to be able to realize the founding principles of the United States, and that the kind of lack of truth and obscuring certain parts of our history hurts us rather than helps us. It keeps us divided, and it again prevents us from being able to live up to the potential and the great promises of America.
Yeah, but somebody is profiting from that division.
Well, I mean, it definitely continues to serve the interests of people who believe that the United States is a nation, by and for white people alone, and I think that's that's kind of what that's what these history wars, these culture wars are about. What kind of country should the United States be, especially in a moment when demographics are changing substantially, and by the year 2050, white people will be the minority.
Right. Yeah. And there's a large chunk of people who want America to be a white ethno-state. We'll be back in just 1 minute. If you can just hang on, Professor Hinton. I've got to read an ad over on the commercial side of the show, and we will be right back. So welcome back. We are speaking right now with Professor Elizabeth Hinton, historian, associate professor of history and African American studies at Yale University, professor of law at the Yale Law School. She has a new book out, America on Fire: The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s. That is absolutely extraordinary. Dr. Hinton, to what extent is America still on fire? Where are we at now, looking back on where we've been, and how best, in your mind, do we move forward in the 4 minutes or so we have left here?
Yeah. I mean, I think the protests of last summer, showed that we're still very much, again, living in the kind of the misguided policy responses to both the nonviolent and violent protests of the 1960s. And I think one of the things that my research really demonstrates, and that many others have drawn our attention to, is the fact that the decision to invest in the police, the police and various surveillance technologies and the prison system at the expense of social welfare programs for people has been a domestic policy failure. It has not, in our most vulnerable communities, meaningfully made a dent in the ongoing problem of crime and gun violence. And the United States now, again, our sheer incarcerating 2.5 million people is a major fiscal drain. It's much more cost effective to invest in things like early childhood programs and job training for people. And so I think that what we saw last summer is a call among a rising generation of young people, especially, who are saying we want a different mode of governance. This hasn't worked, and if we want, there's the pattern. One of the policy cycles after these events is always to think about police reform. And I think one of the lessons is, and what communities are calling for, is that we move beyond the police, because continuing to invest in police, continuing to rely on things like body cameras, which we know don't necessarily stop police killings. The officers who beat Rodney King with nightsticks in their fists said that they did so because chokeholds were banned. In Los Angeles, body cameras don't necessarily lead to more transparency and accountability, as we've seen in recent police killings. And training, we're not going to be able to train our way out of this. So, the lesson here is that we need to invest in an entirely different set of resources beyond the police, giving people access to jobs and robust educational opportunities and decent housing and health care. So these should be some of our priorities moving forward.
Yeah, we have just a little less than a minute. When you present this information that, investing in communities produces a better response than investing in prisons, there is basically one political party in America that is saying, no, we don't want to do that. That's going to raise up people of color more than white people, and we want America to be a white ethno-state. How do we deal with that?
Well, I think part of it is realizing, how these investments impact all of us. Robust school systems for low-income kids in urban areas, if we're pumping money into public schools, will also benefit white kids in rural areas. And so, different spending priorities and a more equitable distribution of resources doesn't have to do with race, but has to do with addressing the widening wealth inequality in our society.
Amen. Professor Elizabeth Hinton, the new book, America on Fire, brilliant. Thank you so much for dropping by today to discuss it with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Thom. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure, too. Thank you so much. We'll be right back.